All right, we'll go ahead and get started. People seem quiet, so they're trickling in, but everybody's pretty well sat down. We're in Leviticus 25 tonight. We're going to start off in verse 35. Leviticus 25, starting with 35. Last time we finished off the discussion of Feast of Booths, which concluded all of our annual festivals that the Jews needed to do. We talked about the similarities between Christ's sacrifice and these feasts. We talked about there's a historical similarity to kind of the progression of Christianity and the kingdom of God as well with these feasts. And so it's kind of deepens a little bit our understanding of the New Testament. And then we got into the year of Jubilee, chapter 25. Year of Jubilee happens every how many years? 50 years. Happens after the 49th. That makes it 50, not 1. So the 50th year. And it's a pretty important year. Every 7 years they're supposed to let the land rest. The 49th year they let the land rest. The 50th year they let the land rest. And then they plant the 3rd year. And so all of their food has to survive the 3 years. Year of Jubilee is announced on the Day of Atonement. We saw that over there in verse 9 of chapter 25. This is the year when everybody goes home. You return to your ancestral lands. And we talked about the limitations of what that actually means. It's referring to village-level land. So if you live in the city, you can't go back and claim your house that your grandfather lived in when he was a child because it's not yours anymore. How much time did you have to redeem a house if you sell it? 1 year. That's it. After that, it becomes the property of the other family, and then they get all rights and can then, if they sell it, have a year to redeem it. It goes back to them. There's one exception to this. What kind of cities can be redeemed at any time? Levitical cities. Now, they can come in and they can redeem it, but when does it revert back to the Levites? You can find that down in verse 33? 32. 33, right around there. 33. They have the right of redemption anytime, but it goes back to the Levites during what year? Jubilee. So they can come in and they can say you have to move out because we, the Levites, need the space again. However, you don't have to leave until that 50th year. That year of Jubilee comes up. So if it's next year, move. If it's 48 years from now, you probably can die in the house. It'll be okay. Like, you don't have to really move very quickly. But it's to make sure the Levites continue to maintain control of their cities. Can you just imagine a whole bunch of people moving into these cities, and then they're buying and selling and buying and selling and buying and selling, and soon nobody knows who's a Levite house and which one did they live in? And no, God's like, it's just the whole city is the Levites. They can take it anytime they want. It goes back during year of Jubilee. So they can't be mean and kick you out just at a moment's notice, unless they're super mean and they do it just before Day of Atonement on year 49. That would be really mean, wouldn't it? Anyways, so that's really what we talked about last time. This time we're going to get into our discussions about poor brethren and what are you supposed to do with them. So what do you do with a poor Jew? What is that interaction going to be like? And specifically we're talking about it in connection to the year of Jubilee. So the Exodus had some regulations, I think in Exodus 21, on what do you do when a Jew is sold into slavery. And so we'll talk a little bit about those regulations as we go along too. Okay, verse 35. If your brother becomes poor and cannot maintain himself with you, you shall support him as though he were a stranger and a sojourner, and he shall live with you. Take no interest from him or profit, but fear your God, that your brother may live beside you. You shall not lend him your money at interest, nor give him your food for profit. I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt to give you the land of Canaan and to be your God. Okay, this is general principle. Remember, that's how Leviticus is written. You have the main principle, which was year of Jubilee. This is a specific principle regarding what do you do with poor Hebrews. One of the options, the primary option, is that they're just living with you now. Now, what does that look like? What does it look like practically? Practically, what it looks like is hospitality according to the ancient world. Many cultures, including the Hebrews, built a separate room onto their home It was considered that hospitality room. It is separate from the normal house. Like you'd have to go outside and into the other door in order to get there. They kept it stocked. They kept it prepared so that when somebody who is traveling comes through, they can say, hey, you can stay here. In many times, actually, we can even see it throughout Scripture occasionally, but Ancient World talks about it, that they didn't even leave it locked. So if you're coming through and it's 1 o'clock in the morning and the family's asleep, you just walk into that house and you just stay the night, and then in the morning you leave. Family comes up, they realize the firewood has been used, or they realize some of the food that's been left in there has been used, and so then they restock it for the next time somebody comes through. That's normal. This is the abnormal. You have a Hebrew who cannot work his land anymore. Maybe it got sold out from under him, his father sold it, and then they have nothing because his father moved him to the city and couldn't make it as in the city, and now they're poor. What are we supposed to do now that we're poor? Option number one is that you're supposed to treat him like a stranger and a sojourner, which means he has access to that room. And he just stays, and stays, and stays, and stays, and stays. That's it. You have to continue to supply the food. You have to continue to supply the space. You have to continue to supply the firewood. You're, in effect, supporting him with his daily bread. That's what you're doing. That's a huge burden. Huge burden. Which means that you have to rely on the fact that God is going to prosper you enough to be able to do this. We see some of those principles in the New Testament, right? Those who sow sparingly reap sparingly. Those who sow bountifully reap bountifully. It's not really talking about making sure you've got a lot of grain out there. It's talking about being kind to those who need it. It's talking about the hospitality principles we're seeing here. Do you believe that God would supply for you? It's the year of Jubilee chapter. Do you believe that God is going to give you enough produce in year 48 that you're going to make it until year 51? Do you believe it or not? Well, most of their history, it seems as though they didn't believe it, but that's a separate discussion. So that's general principle number one. It doesn't happen all the time. It requires people who have the extra ability to have a home that has this extra room. We don't see it very often. Occasionally we see it. I think it's Elijah or Elisha or both. They do it with a widow of Zarephath. Wow, I was not prepared for that. And they build an extra room, and that's what's being discussed here, is a room for hospitality. However, at the end of Judges, we have a different problem, that people come and they're wanting to stay, and there is no one who has a room prepared, no one who invites them home, because nobody has prepared for hospitality for their brethren or for strangers. So we can kind of see how it works practically throughout Scripture. Any comments on that before we talk about what do you do if that's not available? Yeah.
You say this type of room was common in the ancient world, or these types of walls?
Yeah, it is common. Yeah. We can see some of the, archaeology is really where we get a lot of it, where how the Jews built their home with a separate attached. We can see similar foundation styles elsewhere. And so that's the assumption. Well, I'm going to put it that way. It's the assumption. Yeah.
The reason I ask is something that I uncovered as I'm studying for this, our Drew and I's class next quarter, is this idea that a God within a polytheistic system cannot demand much of the worshiper.
Yeah.
Because you can just go somewhere else. But a monotheistic God can exert great demands upon the worshiper because you have nowhere else to go.
Yeah.
And that, as you were kind of talking about how hard this would be, that thought popped into my mind.
Yeah.
That this is hard, but this is the demands that a monotheistic God can make.
And yet, the Jews, for their history, are really polytheistic. That's their response to it, is I'm just going to go worship Baal or Asherah or something of that kind, or Molech. Yep. And still gives me all the prosperity. Any other thoughts? It's a good comment. Okay, let's talk about the specific. If your brother, verse 39, becomes poor beside you and sells himself to you, you shall not make him serve as a slave. He shall be with you as a hired worker and as a sojourner. He shall serve with you until the year of Jubilee. Then he shall go out from you, he and his children with him, and go back to his own clan and return to the possession of his fathers. For they are my servants, whom I brought out of the land of Egypt. They shall not be sold as slaves. You shall not rule over him ruthlessly, but shall fear your God. As for your male and female slaves, whom you have, you may buy male and female slaves from among the nations that are around you. You may also buy from among the strangers who sojourn with you and their clans that are with you, who have been born in your land, and they may be your property. You may bequeath them to your sons after you to inherit as a possession forever. You may make slaves of them, but over your brothers, the people of Israel, you shall not rule one over another ruthlessly. Okay, so this is the next stage of the principle. Sometimes the first one is not an option. I just can't afford to feed you for free. I just can't. But I can afford to treat you as a hired worker. So he comes in as a slave who is treated as a hired worker. Did you catch the semantics there? He is not free like we would think a hired worker would be free. He's not. He is considered as a possession who is treated as not a possession because only God can truly own him. Did you follow that? So when we add in that, and we add in Exodus 21, which talks about you've got a Hebrew slave that comes in, the Hebrew slave is prospering with you, the Hebrew slave chooses not to leave, then they can get their ears pierced, and then they stay forever. The year of Jubilee is irrelevant. That can happen. Exodus 21 also talks about, and it's verses 1 through 6 if you want to read it on your own time. But Exodus 21 also talks about they can only stay a maximum of 6 years. In the 7th year, they go free, regardless of where Sabbath years are. That's not what the point is. That's just the maximum that you can have a Hebrew slave. But they're to be treated like a hired worker. It always talks about if they have children. It always talks about their families. It talks about that they can redeem themselves. If you remember that from just a little bit ago, if he sells part of his property and he redeems it, well, if he sold himself, he can still redeem himself. That's going to be the end of the chapter here, 47 through the end. So they are still amassing wealth because the end goal is for him to give a service and then return to prosperity. That's the goal. The goal is not to create a servant class of Hebrews. The goal is not to create a perpetual slavery house of Hebrews. It's so that in one generation they can go from too poor to live on their own to wealthy enough to go home. That's it. Within that one father's lifetime, he can return and restore the wealth of the family. Okay. Any comments on that? Now, we in America, we have a hard time with the word slave, don't we? We have a lot wrapped up in it. We have a lot of history with it. But this is a good option for a Hebrew. And I want us to kind of remember that. Your choice is die or be a slave and paid. That was it. These are the options before you. And so it was a better choice for him to have some of his freedoms taken away, which, as you can see, for a Hebrew, he still has a lot of his freedoms. Strangers and sojourners don't. They are slaves entirely. They can stay forever. They can be handed down as property. They're much more what we're accustomed to in the idea of slavery. However, for the Hebrew, he still has some rights. He is still Hebrew. And his end goal is to be prosperous again. Hopefully within 7 years, as Exodus 21 says, but potentially needing longer. Any comments or thoughts? Good. So let's talk about what happens if he makes a bunch of money. Verse 47, if a stranger or a sojourner with you becomes rich, and your brother becomes poor, and sells himself to the stranger or sojourner with you, or to a member of the stranger's clan, then after he is sold, he may be redeemed. One of his brothers may redeem him, or his uncle or his cousin may redeem him, or a close relative from his clan may redeem him, or if he grows rich, he may redeem himself. He shall calculate with his buyer from the year when he is sold to him until the year of Jubilee. The price of his sale shall vary with the number of years. The time he was with his owner shall be rated as the time of a hired worker. If there are still many years left, he shall pay proportionally for his redemption some of his sale price. If there remains but a few years until the year of Jubilee, he shall calculate and pay for his redemption in proportion to his years of service. He shall treat him as a worker hired year by year. He shall not rule ruthlessly over him in your sight. And if he is not redeemed by these means, then he and his children with him shall be released in the year of Jubilee. For it is to me that the people of Israel are servants. They are my servants whom I brought out of the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. Okay. We know what happens with a Hebrew who owns a Hebrew. What happens if you're someone else who owns a Hebrew? Almost exactly the same law, isn't it? You live in our land, you abide by our laws. God says the same thing. You cannot treat a Hebrew, whether you are Hebrew or not. You cannot treat him as a slave. You treat him as a hired worker. He continues to amass wages. He continues to be supported as a hired worker, which means that you have provided him room and board. That's what that's talking about. Whether you are Hebrew or not, this requires amount of control over the land, a sovereignty over the land of Canaan. This means that the kings or the judges must actually be rulers rather than just people making recommendations. And they have to force everyone to be godly. Whether you want to obey God or not, you will behave as God has decreed. So first principle is, if he sells himself to a foreigner, one of his relatives is obligated to redeem him. Means that he comes, he buys him out, and brings him home, and principle number one goes into effect at that point, and he lives with you until he gets his feet under him. That's going right back to general principle there. You have taken him, brought him home to his ancestral homes. Which means the Hebrews have to have enough authority in their own land to force someone who lawfully purchased a slave to let him go at no profit. Well, that's intense, isn't it? Because that's the principle going on here. He still has to redeem himself based on years of service, connected to the year of Jubilee or connected to the original agreement, whatever it is, whether it's the 7 years or year of Jubilee. He still has to proportionalize all of that. But you're not making a profit off of this because we're Hebrews and you live in a Hebrew land and you're going to obey us. Like, that's intense. So that's number one. What happens if he makes enough money? Notice he's not being treated as property, he's being treated as a hired worker, which means that by necessity, he has to be making an income. If he makes enough to purchase himself out, he gets to do that. All right, any comments anybody has on that? Yeah.
Verse 55, just to pick up on the slave imagery.
Yeah.
When it says the people of Israel, my servant, it is saying, if you got the English Standards footnote, it says slave.
Yeah.
So they were slaves in Egypt, and God released them to become his slaves. And in fact, that is the number one way believers of God are described. Whether it's Old Testament or New Testament, slave imagery is the most dominant way believers, or today Christians, are described.
Yeah.
And you're right, it is something that we don't, because of the American slave system, we kind of have a slanted idea of what this really meant.
Yeah.
And looked like. But we need to recognize that that's who we are in relation to God.
Yeah, very true. Any other thoughts? Yeah.
I did, within the Hebrew society, Hebrews are treated the way that Hebrews are treated, and how that system with slavery or indentured servitude, however you want to look at it in their situation, how that works and everything. It's always been curious to me, though, how so many of the things that God instituted with the Israelites, the Hebrews, are structured solely around keeping them from being like the nations around them.
Yeah.
And yet, in this one category, they're allowed to be exactly like the nations around them when it comes to slavery with a foreigner.
Yeah.
So if they were to get somebody from a foreign land, however it might be, and I'm going to say that this would include spoils of war, etc. It's always struck me as odd that they can be just like the nations around them in this area.
Yeah.
Thoughts?
I agree.
I've never understood that. But
Some of it is how they viewed, especially people who were in slavery that are spoils of war, how the ancients viewed that. They viewed them as dead people. They're literally walking corpses because the gods decreed you should have died on the battlefield. They chose not to take your soul, but you're still dead. And so that principle with slavery in the ancient world is very strong. And so that's the way slaves are always viewed. They're lost, they're dead. Therefore, it's a dead body. You can do whatever you want with a dead body. It's your possession. It's just an object. And that's where that distance comes in. It was not uncommon. In fact, like Greeks, when they had their slaves, many of them become very educated. Many of them are incredibly ill-treated and die very young. It just depends on how they're used. But definitely, slavery slavery itself in the ancient world is a good study for us, just because it's so different than how we view it. And so go into it thinking of it as an ancient person instead of thinking of it as a modern person. It had its purpose, it had its place in life, especially in a pre-industrial society. You don't have a tractor, you need to buy one. So you buy a slave, like that's your tractor. Maybe 3 slaves, there's your tractor. Any other thoughts? Good comments, yeah.
Point. In that scenario, a foreigner is somebody who does not believe in Yahweh. If you believe in Yahweh, you're not treated like a foreigner, you're treated like a Jew.
Yeah.
So here is somebody who refuses to convert. So that's one of the reasons they're going to be at the bottom. Now, in 2007, I preached a sermon here on slave imagery. I'm sure everybody remembers it.
Totally, I was here for that.
But anyway, that's...
Yeah, it's definitely a good study. I would encourage you to delve into it. Because it's everywhere. That's the main image that describes God's people is slaves of Him. What does that really mean?
Any of those who did, I guess you'd call them slaves, or ones that had been taken in and then let go, how did they make a living?
You mean specifically of Hebrews? There's not a lot of references to it because they were just normal. You brought in, you're treated as a hired worker. You make a living, but you don't have to pay for room and board because you're a possession, you're at the property. And so, yeah, you have an income. You can go back to your ancestral lands. You have something saved. You have some wealth built up. Within 7 years, you may have increased your family size, which means you have extra workers. But yeah, you're just in a different place 7 years later. Any other thoughts? Okay, that's it for Year of Jubilee. Let's head over to chapter 24. So I got a few they don't really fit anywhere else, and so I put the chapter 24, 1 through 9, and I put chapter 27, 30 to 34 together because they're just like tabernacle stuff. I don't remember what I specifically called it, but like provisions for the tabernacle. I think I was much fancier in the class book, but that's what it is. It's just stuff with the tabernacle that the Levites needed to manage. They needed to be prepared for. So in chapter 24, we have 2 of them. They need to be managing the oil for the lamps, and making sure that is always there. Remember, there was that fancy lampstand inside of the tabernacle must always be burning. And the showbread that we're going to talk about in 24, and then the tithe we're going to talk about in chapter 27. So 24 verses 1 through 4, the Lord says to Moses, "Command the people of Israel to bring you pure oil from beaten olives for the lamp, that a light may be kept burning regularly, outside the veil of the testimony in the tent of meeting. Aaron shall arrange it from evening to morning before the Lord regularly. It shall be a statute forever throughout your generations. He shall arrange the lamps on the lampstand of pure gold before the Lord regularly." Did you get the point about regularly? I don't even know how many times I said that. 4 or 5 times in there. This is to happen frequently. Not as a regulated command, though. Just as a needed point. That's the word regularly here. If I was a high priest, I would have set it up on a schedule. Every 2 months, you bring in your oil, or whatever, however long and however much you could store. But the point is, the people are responsible for this. Not the Levites. The people of Israel are responsible for making sure that there is beaten olives in order to produce pure oil, in order to keep this light going inside of the tabernacle. It's its only light source. There's probably a little bit, maybe coals from the altar of incense, but this is the primary light source that serves the inside of the tabernacle. It is the fancy candelabra with the multiple heads and very fancily carved. It is the light of God that is burning forever inside the tabernacle. Any comments on that? Because the next one's a little bit more action-packed. Verse 5, you shall take fine flour and bake 12 loaves from it. 2/10 of an ephah shall be in each loaf. You shall set them in 2 piles, 6 in a pile, on the table of pure gold before the Lord. You shall also put pure frankincense on each pile, that it may go with the bread as a memorial portion, as a food offering to the Lord. Every Sabbath day Aaron shall arrange it before the Lord regularly. It is from the people of Israel as a covenant forever. It shall be for Aaron and his sons, and they shall eat it in a holy place, since it is for him a most holy portion out of the Lord's food offerings, a perpetual due. Okay. So this is to take care of the table of showbread, the table of bread, the unleavened breads, the 12 or 10 of them or whatever it was. I know I just read it. 12 of them stacked in 2 piles of 6. They're to be used of fine flour. There's a specific amount of flour that is to be used in each of them. They're to be placed on there. Frankincense is to be put on there. How often do they replace it? Every Sabbath day, Aaron shall arrange it. So they have work they're doing on the Sabbath day. Priests don't get the Sabbath off. Everybody realize that? Like, they work harder on a Sabbath day. It's kind of like preachers on a Sunday. That's the reason preachers are exhausted at the end of a Sunday, speaking from experience. We don't get that as a day of rest. That's not a day to calm down. But anyways, so every day Aaron is to be arranging it. He is the one, not one of his sons. The high priest is doing this. Now that's a big difference too. Most of the work at the tabernacle is really done by regular priest level. The high priest is occasionally mentioned. Sometimes he's mentioned when blood has to be put in certain places, or it's a specific feast day, but otherwise he's really more just there, not specifically mentioned as being responsible. Aaron, however, is responsible for this. He is the one providing the food that stays on the Sabbath day. When did they eat the bread? On the Sabbath day. They replace it, and then they eat it. Verse 8 and verse 9 here. So it is their food that day. While they're doing their other sacrifices, while they're doing their other work, they've got, I think, doubled the amount of sacrifices that they do on an average day, just as a normal part of keeping the tabernacle functioning. If I remember right, I think it's doubled. This is the food they're supposed to be eating. This fine flour loaves, unleavened loaves, it says in Exodus, with frankincense piled upon it. This would be the same stuff David eats, by the way. That section is just always fascinating to me, that David eats it, Jesus argues it, and I'm confused still at the end. Right? Anyways, I'm not going to get into that because that'll be the rest of the class. All right, any comments anybody has on the oil or the bread? Okay. Last chapter, 27. I knew there wouldn't be much. So I didn't know what to do with these sections. They don't fit anywhere. They're just stuff with the tabernacle. So verse 30 to 34 here, the very last thing that Moses records down in Leviticus is about the tithe. Every tithe of the land, it tells us in verse 30, whether of the seed of the land or of the fruit of the trees, is the Lord's, it is holy to the Lord. If a man wishes to redeem some of his tithe, he adds 1/5 to it. Okay, principle number 1 is, what if it's a growing thing? A growing thing, it tells us, you can redeem, verse 31. You have to add 1/5. Means I really need the food more than I need my money. That's really what we're getting at here. So I can buy it back plus a fifth because food is more valuable to me than whatever silver or gold I happen to have. That's not the case when it comes to the animals, though. In verse 32, every tithe of herds and flocks, every 10th animal of all that pass under the herdsman's staff shall be holy to the Lord. One shall not differentiate between good and bad, neither shall he make a substitute for it. If he does substitute for it, then both it and the substitute shall be holy. It shall not be redeemed. These are the commands that the Lord commanded Moses for the people of Israel on Mount Sinai. What about with the herds? Now, this one's fascinating to me. I don't know if you guys picked up on it. But all through Leviticus, God makes one point about every single animal that is used. What is the one thing he harps on every single time? What kind of animal does it need to be? Without blemish. And then we get to the tithe. What does he say for the tithe animal? Number 10. Doesn't matter. So the picture we have here, when it talks about every tithe of the herds that passes under the herdsman's staff, they funnel them down, they hold a staff, and they go 1, 2, 3, 4, until they get to 10, that one comes out. Doesn't matter what it is, doesn't matter if it's young, it's old, it's fat, it's ugly, it's scarred, it's whatever. 10 it is. But what if I need that one? Can I redeem it? No, and you better not try. Did you see that? What is the consequence if I try to make a substitute even? They both go. Don't argue with that Levite that comes for your tithe. Don't argue with him. Because if it's your best one that you were saving for some peace offering, it's gone. If you really want to look like you're more holy and so you'd rather give a good one instead of that old ugly one, no, both of them go now. If you're just rude and you want the one that's there, nope, 2 of them go now. Don't mess with the tithe when it comes to animals. You can mess with it some when it comes to produce, but not with animals. Any comments anybody has? And I'd submit to you, this is probably to stop mistreatment. That's more than likely why that's there. Produce of the land, if you're giving money plus a fifth, they can buy that. But if you're always substituting, like the good one was the 10th, and so you're going to substitute a bad one in there, and another bad one, and so the Levitical priests, or the Levite flocks, only have bad sheep in it, because that's all the tithe that they get, they're just going to have bad flocks then. So this is probably to stop mistreatment, and God says you're just doing it all. Make no judgment whatsoever. 10 is mine. Any thoughts anybody has before we go on? Yeah.
To your point, like it basically does 2 things. It makes it so that the owner of the flock or whatever is being tithed doesn't try to manipulate the system in any way. And also the Levites don't try to manipulate the system in any way. So nobody's getting, twisted or nobody's getting shafted in any way.
Yeah.
And so they don't try to take the best of everything you've got, and you don't try to give the worst of everything you've got. It just is what it is.
Yeah. And that's probably a good point, the Levite side of it as well. After all, Eli's sons are priests, and if they're in the discussion at all, we definitely got to watch out for bad Levites. Any other thoughts? Okay. Let's head to chapter 19. So moving into the last big section in my class material is about civic holiness. I didn't have a better term for that. But it's not Levitical holiness. This is about normal Hebrew holiness. Levites are going to be included in this because they are Hebrews, but this is everybody. This is how God views your holiness. This is what sets you apart from everybody else. This is what sets you apart from the man that you were 4 days ago, because you're moving forward to be more holy than you used to be. And so this is the beginning of it. Chapter 19 is a list of rules. That's all it is. Rule after rule after rule after rule. To help you understand, this is how I want you to behave. So the first section talks a lot about, which is verse 1 down through verse 8, talks about your relationship with God. From verse 9 down through verse 18 is a lot of how do we have a society rules. How do we not kill each other in the streets rules? Those are those. And 19 to the end of the chapter is really very individual. How can you be a better person than you used to be? So let's go into these. In verse 1, the Lord says to Moses, and he says, "Speak to all the congregation of the people of Israel and say to them, you shall be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy. Every one of you shall revere his mother and his father, and you shall keep my Sabbaths. I am the Lord your God." What is the first thing that he says to the Hebrews of how to be a holy person? You got to treat your parents right. Honor your parents, revere your parents, treat them appropriately. That's number one. Then he moves into keep my Sabbaths. Why are those two joined together? Why say revere your father and your mother and keep my Sabbaths? What do you guys think?
That it would go well within the land.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. Sabbaths especially, and honoring your father and mother. I mean, that's quoted in the New Testament, right? Why would those two matter, though? What do you learn on the Sabbath? You learn about the Lord. It's a holy convocation. You're supposed to be together with people. This should make you more holy, shouldn't it? Like that just should happen. People who come to an assembly of godly people regularly should become more holy. Therefore, there's a great distinction here. If you miss the Sabbaths, you don't go to the Sabbaths, you're during a time period where the Hebrews don't keep the Sabbath, what would we expect to see them do to their parents? Turn them away. So much so that even Jesus has to kind of argue against this because they're not even keeping Sabbaths correctly during his time and making a big deal over nothing, that they have established a whole way to not take care of your parents, which they called Corban. It's fascinating that he argues against that, and he argues against the Sabbath a ton of how they're misusing it and them trying to catch him on the Sabbath. It's everywhere because that's the first stuff. I am the Lord your God. This is the beginning of holiness. Keep the Sabbath and take care of your parents. So what's thing number 2? Verse 4. Do not turn to idols or make for yourselves any gods or cast metal. I am of cast metal. I am the Lord your God. If we were writing Leviticus, that would have been number 1, wouldn't it? Don't worship a different god. Don't make an idol of any kind. Don't even make an idol that is God. Like, just don't. But he starts with taking care of family. And then he moves into, you're going to then take care of me. Any thoughts before we go on to the next one? Yeah.
I think, too, it leads one into the other. If you respect your parents and the way that they brought you up, and you keep the Sabbath, then you're not going to fall into verse 4.
Yeah.
It's not going to happen because you're doing the things to stay on the right path.
Yeah. While you were saying that, I had an idea. It's almost fully baked. In Judges, there's the story of Micah. It's towards the end. We don't talk about it enough because he's not a judge. He's just a dude. But it tells us some things about him, which I'm not even sure what chapter it is. Like, I can't turn over there. It's towards the end. One of the things we learn is that he steals a bunch of money from his mother. Another thing we very quickly learn is that rather than giving it back, which he does try, and then she says, you keep it, he then goes and makes an idol. It's just fascinating to me that that is how his story is introduced. And here in Leviticus 19, that is how this is introduced. And then he gets himself a Levite who does his own sacrifices for him, which is the third thing down from verse 5 through the end, is talking about sacrifices being tainted. I never made that connection before. So read the story of Micah and see if you guys can see it in there. Verse 5, let's add it in. When you offer a sacrifice of peace offerings to the Lord, you shall offer it so that you may be accepted. It shall be eaten the same day after you offer it, or on the day after, depending upon the kind of peace offering, if you recall. Anything left over until the third day shall be burned up with fire. If it is eaten at all on the third day, it is tainted, it shall not be accepted. Everyone who eats it shall bear his iniquity because he has profaned what is holy to the Lord, and that person shall be cut off from his people. Remember, during their wandering years, every single animal that is killed is a peace offering. All of them. God says, you shall not go into the field and kill your animal. You shall not go into your tent and kill your animal. You will bring it to me. It will be a peace offering, and then you take it. Meaning you better be prepared. Because if you're killing too many animals and suddenly you can't eat them all, you can't store it. So in their wandering years, they have no storage of meat. It's fresh at the minimum 2 days, or the maximum 2 days. Once they get into the land, they don't have to go to the temple or the tabernacle in order to do that. Those laws get laxed. And so then they can be a little bit different. But this is very much a wandering years comment, that your peace offerings are very important to God. It's not just killing off your meals. Because you can imagine, you've been doing this 24 years. 24 years of, all right, take the sheep up there, we need some more. And so your little kid goes and takes, like, you could just see them trivializing it. But no, this is important. Any comments anyone has before we get into the next section? Okay, so that is how God wants them to be holy in connection to him. So how are they supposed to be holy in connection to each other? That's the next section. Verse 9. When you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not reap your field right up to its edge, neither shall you gather the gleanings after your harvest. And you shall not strip your vineyard bare, neither shall you gather the fallen grapes of your vineyard. You shall leave them for the poor, for the sojourner. I am the Lord your God. It's part of that hospitality. This is to take care of everybody. Remember, the purpose of living in the land of Canaan is for every single person to live in the land of Canaan. Not to suffer in the land of Canaan, not to be punished in the land of Canaan, but it's to create a system where everyone takes care of everybody and everybody lives a good life. Now, they fail miserably at this because they missed the first part and they go after other gods and they mistreat each other and they just don't do what they're supposed to do. And so we see punishment and war and famine and droughts and things like that because God is trying to get them to come back. End of Deuteronomy talks about that. We're going to see it even in end of Leviticus. We'll talk about some of those as well. But this is the principle. You're supposed to take care of each other. There should be food at all times for every single person in the land of Canaan because you've left it. The next one, verse 11, you shall not steal, you shall not deal falsely, you shall not lie to one another, you shall not swear by my name falsely, and so profane the name of your God. I am the Lord. You have to tell the truth to your neighbors. And there's a really, really simple reason for this. They don't move. Can you just imagine that your grandfather was lied to by his grandfather? And so your fathers didn't like each other. And they bickered all the time. And they threw things in each other's field. And they yelled at each other from across the boundaries. And maybe occasionally they whacked each other. What are you going to do on your level? No one's moving. That feud just keeps passed down and down and down. And so God's like, no, we're going to start off. Don't lie to each other. Don't oppress each other. Don't mistreat each other. Don't deal falsely. Don't swear by my name in your dealings unless you're going to actually keep it. Because these people, in the year of Jubilee, it doesn't matter if they moved away, they're coming back. And you're going to have to keep dealing with them and keep dealing with them and keep dealing with them. In a very real sense, you might also be related to them. So now we're looking at how you are interacting with your own family. Are you lying to them? Because let me tell you, they're not going anywhere either because this is their land that you live on. Just like the land they live on is yours. Any thoughts on that before we get into 13? I think we can do one more. Okay. You shall not oppress your neighbor or rob him. The wages of a hired worker shall not remain with you all night until the morning. You shall not curse the deaf or put a stumbling block before the blind, but you shall fear your God. I am the Lord. Interacting with each other now, you're not lying, you're not stealing, because that's going to cause a breakdown of society. But now when you work with someone, you've hired your neighbor, treat him with respect. If you have agreed on a wage, he is to get that wage every single evening. It's not to wait until tomorrow, which means that every single day you need to sit down, like Jesus says, and count whether or not you've got enough to do this thing. If you don't have enough to pay your wage, or the wages at the end of the day, you can't hire anybody then because you can't pay them and you're being unholy. You shall not curse the deaf or put a stumbling block before the blind. It breaks down society, how people treat those who have handicaps. It breaks you down. It creates a society that is wicked in their hearts. And it's just, read history. Societies that treat the handicapped well are nicer, just objectively, than those who mistreat the handicapped. So if everybody in your village makes fun of the deaf guy, it says more about you. It talks about the evil in your own heart. And it breaks down your village. It breaks down its holiness. It breaks down your society. Because then what do your kids do? They start bad mouthing everybody else, not just those with the handicap. And you get more and more wicked. Okay, we'll pick up with 15 next time. We're going to get into chapter 20 a little bit, but read chapters 12 and 13. That's the big one. We're going to get into bodily holiness for the next 2 weeks. So, yay. Thank you.